Today I'm going to tell you a Bible story so you can relax. I'm going to tell you the story of Joseph. I know you know it, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. Jacob had 4 wives and 12 sons, but the one he thought the most of was Joseph, because he was the oldest son of Rachel, his favorite wife. He made Joseph a beautiful coat. You know, we learned in the old King James it was a coat of many colors. I still think of it like that. But they tell us now it probably wasn't a coat of many colors, but at any rate, it was a long and elaborate robe, and the brothers were jealous of Joseph. And to make matters worse, Joseph had a dream. He said, let me tell you a dream. He said, I dreamed I was out in the field with all of you, and we were cutting wheat. You know, you see the shocks, little shocks. They take a sickle and cut it and then wrap it up. He said, my sheath stood up out in the field, and all of your 11 sheaves came and bowed down to my sheath. And they said, you trying to say we're going to worship you? And they hated him for it. They're jealous of him. Then he had another dream, make it even worse. He dreamed, he said, listen to this dream. I dreamed that the moon and the sun and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And his father said, do you saying that even your mother and I will bow down and worship you? He was kind of offended at it too. Well, to make matters worse, Joseph seems like he just creates more and more jealousy as he goes along. He goes out into the field with his brothers, tending the sheep. He comes back and he gives Jacob a story. He tells them a bad report on his brothers. And the brothers hated him all the more. Now one day, Jacob called Joseph and he says, go and find your brothers and the sheep. They're tending sheep down at Shechem. Go check on them, see how they're doing, come back and give me a report. So Joseph goes to Shechem and they're not there. He's wandering around in the field and the man says, who are you looking for? He said, I'm looking for my brothers. I had some sheep here. He said, they've gone to Dothan. So Joseph goes to Dothan. That's where his brothers are. And they see him coming from a distance with this beautiful coat on. And they say, here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him and put him in one of these cisterns here. And then let's see what becomes of his fancy dreams. So they got him. They didn't kill him, but they took the robe off of him and put him in a cistern. Cisterns are things that people built to catch water when it rained. Around here, they used to have cisterns. If you didn't have a well and couldn't find a well, no running water, you could build a cistern, build a thing down in the ground, usually brick or something, you know, have some kind of bottom to hold water, and the runoff in your house would catch there, and that was your water. I mean, that's what you lived on. That's what you cooked with and drank and everything. Anyway, it was dry at this time, so they put him in here, and they sat down to eat. Now, Reuben tried to save him. Reuben had gotten in trouble with his father, and his father had kind of rejected him as the oldest son. So they didn't listen to Reuben. But as they sat down to eat, they looked and they saw a camel caravan coming, the ships of the sea, they called it, and they were loaded down with balm and myrrh and spices. And they're headed to Egypt. And Judah, who was about the 4th son, seemed to always be a leader. Judah said, let's don't kill the boy and be guilty of blood. Let's sell him. And so they sold Joseph to these Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they carried him down to Egypt and sold him, I guess, on the slave market. And a guy named Potiphar bought him. You ever see this show? Oh, Jimmy Stewart, about Christmas time. What's it? Wonderful Life. And the old bad guy in there is named Potiphar. That's where they got the name from this Bible story. So Potiphar buys him. Potiphar is one of Pharaoh's high officials. He's actually captain of the guard. And so Potiphar buys Joseph, and he finds out he's a good worker and a good slave, and he puts him in charge of his household. And soon he realizes that everything Joseph touches just turns out great. So he put him in charge of everything. Well, it said he was handsome and well built, and Potiphar's wife took notice of it, and she kept saying, "Come to bed with me." He said, "I can't do that. Well, how could I do such a thing to my boss? My owner has put me in charge of everything. I could not sin against him and God." But one day he was in there tending to his duties, and she grabbed his robe and says, "Come to bed with me." And he ran out and left her with the robe. And she screamed. And the earl of the servants came in, and she told him, she says, "This slave that he's brought in here tried to make sport of me, but I grabbed I screamed, and when he ran out of the room and left his robe." So anyway, when Potiphar comes home that night, she tells her husband that story. And he takes Joseph and puts him in prison, the prison that a dungeon actually. And Joseph is in this prison. I tried to find out how long. I have heard somewhere he was there 9 years. I don't know whether I got that, just made it up. I don't know where I got it. but 9 years sticks in my mind. Maybe Josephus, I don't know. But he was in prison 9 years. After he'd been there a long time, Pharaoh got mad at his cupbearer and his baker, and he put them in prison, in the same prison where Joseph was. Now, Joseph had been given the duty of kind of tending to the other prisoners, and so he goes around, and one morning he goes to them, and they're all down in the dumps, and he said, "Why you look so gloomy?" And they said, "We had dreams, and nobody can interpret the dream." He said, "Well, tell me your dream. Maybe I can interpret it." So the cupbearer, he tells his dream. He said, "I was standing by Pharaoh, and this vine grew up. And this vine grew 3 branches. And then on these branches, a cluster of grapes began to appear. And I reached up in my dream and got the cluster of grapes and squeezed them into the cup. And then I handed Pharaoh the cup." And Joseph said, "The 3 vines are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will call you and restore you to your job as cupbearer." When the baker heard he got a good report, he thought, "Now let me tell you my dream." He said, "Now I was walking along, and I had 3 baskets on my head. In the top basket was full of bread, and the birds of the air came and were eating the bread out of the basket." And Joseph said, "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will call you up. He will impale you." Now that's a terrible thing they used to do to people. Drive a pole in the ground, sharpen it, and jab you down on it and let you die. Impale you on a stick. And the birds of the air will come and eat your flesh. Now, how'd you like to have a prophecy like that about you? That you had a dream, and that's the interpretation. Within 3 days, that's exactly what happened. Joseph told the cupbearer, he says, "When you are restored to Pharaoh, tell him about me, and tell him that I have not done anything wrong, especially anything enough to justify being put in this dungeon." But when the cupbearer was restored to his position, he completely forgot about Joseph. And then Pharaoh has a dream. Pharaoh dreams he's standing by the Nile River. And up from the Nile River comes 7 fat, sleek cows. And then behind them, here comes 7 skinny cows. And the skinny cows come along and eat up the fat cows. Cow eating a cow, that's an odd thing. But then he went back to sleep, and he had another dream. And he dreamed that there was this field, and there were 7 fat, sleek grains of wheat. And then here comes 7 skinny grains of wheat, stalks of wheat. And the 7 skinny ones eat up the fat ones. He called all of his fortune tellers and all of his people for an interpretation, but they couldn't figure it out. And suddenly the cupbearer said, "I am now reminded of my error. When I was in prison, there was a man who interpreted my dream and the baker's dream, and they both came true. Pharaoh sent for Joseph. Now, in this prison, I don't guess he'd ever had a shave in 9 years, or a haircut, or a bath, or anything. Probably the same old rags he put in there with. And Joseph, they shaved himself, gave a change of clothes, and he goes before Pharaoh. And he says, I understand you can interpret dreams. And he said, no man can interpret dreams. That's a privilege of God. But tell me your dream, God will give you the interpretation. So he told Joseph the dream, and Joseph said, the 7 fat cows and the 7 fat grains of wheat are all the same dream. It means you're going to have 7 years of plenty. 7 years of plenty. But that'll be followed by 7 years of drought. And the drought will eat up all the grain and all the fatness that was accumulated during the 7 years. And he said, the fact that you've had 2 dreams, the same thing, means that it's certain and it's going to happen soon. And so Pharaoh said, well, what should we do? And he said, find a man with understanding and wisdom, and have him go around through Egypt and to build grain bins, and during the good years store up grain, and then when the bad times come, you'll have grain to eat. Well, Pharaoh said, I don't know of anybody with more wisdom and understanding than you, so why I'm going to appoint you. So Joseph goes from being a slave who was a prisoner to being ruler of Egypt. He gave him a signet ring, and he was in charge. Only Pharaoh was superior to him. He was second in command over the whole land of Egypt. And during the year he traveled, he was given a chariot, he was given a wife, he had 2 sons. Do you know their names? Manasseh and Ephraim. And we'll get into that in another day. But anyway, he traveled around and he built grain bins. And during the good years, he stored up a filth of all the grain that was made. They stored up so much grain that they lost count of it. They couldn't keep up. They didn't have figures enough to figure up, how high it was. It was so much grain. And then the bad years started, and people became to Joseph, and he sold them grain. Well, the drought also had reached Canaan. Back home, Jacob and all his family, they began to be in want. And Jacob says, I hear that there's grain in Egypt. Go down and buy us some grain. And so here they go. 10 of the brothers, he left Benjamin at home. He wouldn't send Benjamin because Benjamin, Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife. And for a long time she had no children. Finally she had Joseph. Then she had Benjamin years later. He was much younger than Joseph. As she was having the child, she died, and she says, name him Ben-Oni, which means son of my trouble. But Jacob said, no, I'm not calling him that. Called him Benjamin. And so that became Joseph's only true full brother. Well, Joseph one day, now remember, he is dressed like an Egyptian. He's in a chariot. He's dressed like a king. He speaks Egyptian. And he looks up, and here comes 10 of his brothers. And he knows them. He recognizes them. They have no earthly idea who he is. He is a complete stranger. He speaks rough to them. He speaks through an interpreter. He can understand everything they say. And they have no idea that he can understand what he's saying. And he speaks rough to them. He said, who are you and where are you from? And they said, we've come to buy grain. We live in the land of Canaan. He said, no, you're not. You're spies. You come here to scout out the land and to see where our weaknesses are. You're going to attack us. That's what you're about. Oh, no, no. They said, no, no. We said, we are all sons of one man. Originally, there was 12 of us, and one of them is no more. Of course, Joseph is the one that they're talking about who is no more. They don't say he's dead. They don't say that they sold him as a slave, and they don't know what happened to him. And one is no more. And the other one, the father keeps him at home because he's born in his old age, and he's afraid to let him out of his sight. So Joseph said, no, I don't believe that story. I believe that you're spies. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put you in prison. I'm going to let one of you go back and get this boy that you say you got another brother at home. You go get him and bring him here, and that'll prove to me that you're telling the truth. Otherwise, you're liars, you're spies, and you're going to stay in prison. Well, he put him in prison 3 days. But then he got to feeling bad about it. He got to thinking about, see, he knows who they are and that they're not spies, and he knows that their families are in need. And he said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let one of you stay here in my custody, in jail. And the rest of you can go back and take your grain with you to feed your starving families. And so he sent them on their way, but he told the steward, put the money back in the mouth of their sack. And so they head out and they go. That night they stopped to feed their donkeys, and they opened their sacks of wheat, and there the silver was in the sack. And each one by one they opened them, and there the silver is. And they said, oh me, they were afraid. They didn't know what this meant. And it would take them a while to figure it out. They go back to Jacob, and they tell him the story. And Jacob said, you're depriving me of my children. First, Joseph is gone. Now Simeon is gone. That's the one that Joseph killed. And now you want to take my other one. That would make me short 3 sons. And he said, no, you will not take Benjamin, no matter what. Well, they ate the grain, and they began to get hungry. And Jacob said, go back and get some more grain. And finally, Reuben came and said, Father, I'll tell you what, I will be responsible for Benjamin. Let him go with me. And I'll be responsible for him, and if I don't bring him back, you can kill my 2 sons. Well, Jacob wasn't going to do that. He said, no, he's not going. Then later on, Judah says, Father, he said, that man told us that unless we bring our young brother, that we would never see his face again. And so we're not going unless you'll send Benjamin. And Jacob said, well, I mean, he didn't have much to lose. They're going to starve to death anyway, all of them, including Benjamin. So what have they got to lose? He said, if it must be, it must be. And so he decides to send Benjamin back. But he said, take double the money. Take the money that was in your sack and give that back to him. Take some more money to pay for your grain. Take some honey and some pistachio nuts and some myrrh and some balm and some goodies from the land and give the man. So they go, and here Joseph sees his long-lost brother, Benjamin, that he's not seen in, well, let's see how old he is now. We know that he was 17 years old when he was sold, and he was 30 years when he became ruler over Egypt. That's 13 years. He was in prison 9 of those years. Just think, when he became king, he had been in prison 1/3 of his life, 9 years out of 30. Since that time, there's been 7 good years and 7 bad years. And Joseph now is 30, 37, 38, 30, he's 39 years old now because it's the 2nd year of the drought. He's a grown man now, not a little boy, full beard. He sees his brother Benjamin, And he went away and he cried to himself. Just think now, how many nights did old Joseph lie awake? He had nobody to help him, nobody to talk to, nobody to comfort him in any way. He's all alone. He's sold as a slave. He doesn't know the language. He's got to work with somebody else. Now he's falsely accused and put into prison. And it looks like things are not going well for Joseph. Sometimes the Lord was working a plan with Joseph, but remember this, Joseph didn't know that. Joseph did not know the outcome that we do. We have read the story and we know how it comes out, but Joseph didn't know that. It's only revealed to him one step at a time as he plays it out. He is God's instrument, you might say, in what he wants to do. So Joseph, he goes away, and he has to cry a little bit. He really hadn't had a full release yet, but he's so all this years, all this sorrow, all this problem has been bottled up inside him for all this time, and it's just hard not to let some of it out. Anyway, he says, take these men to my house. They're going to eat with me. He said, go slaughter a calf and get it ready and fix a feast where they're going to eat with me. So the steward took the 11 brothers to his house. They think he's going to take them captive and kill them. They don't know who he is. He still hadn't told himself who he was. So they go to the steward and they say, listen, let me talk to you. They said, when we got off and we fed our donkeys on the way back, we found our silver in our sack. Look, we brought it back, and here it is. And we have more money to pay. And the steward says, don't worry about it. Your God must have put your money in the sack. I got your gold, your silver, he says. So anyway, they are very uneasy. And then Joseph comes home to eat lunch, and they sit down. Now Joseph ate by himself. The brothers ate by themselves, and the Egyptians ate by themselves. It was an abomination to an Egyptian to eat with a Hebrew. And so they didn't like shepherds, anything about them. They didn't want anything to do with them. And so they all ate separately. And Joseph would send portions of food out to his brothers, especially to Benjamin, extra portions. And then the next morning, he told the steward, he says, okay, fill their sacks up with grain, put the silver back in the sack, and then the youngest brother put my silver cup that I drink out of. And so that's what the steward did. He put his silver cup in there. And the brothers went on their way. And that night they get out. Well, actually, after they had gone a piece, Joseph sent his steward, says, go catch those men and ask them, why do you repay good for evil, for good? He said, one of you has stolen my silver cup, and whoever has this silver cup will become my slave. And so that's what the steward told them. And they said, oh, far be it from us to do such a thing as that. Whoever finds it whoever has this silver cup must die. They didn't think anybody had it. They thought, you're wrong. And he says, and the rest of us will be your slaves. But the steward searched, and sure enough, in Benjamin's sack, here's the silver cup. When they saw the silver cup, they were distressed. They loaded their grain back on their donkeys, and they all come trudging back into Egypt. And now they've just bowed down at the ground before Joseph. And when he did, he remembered his dream. Suddenly that dream came back to him of him standing there and his brothers bowing down to him, and now it had all come true. And anyway, Joseph no longer could control himself. And he told his brothers, he told the Egyptians, have everybody to get out of my presence. Just leave me alone. just me and these boys. And so they come to him and he says, I am Joseph, your brother. How is my father? He's still alive. They were so shocked to hear that they couldn't even answer him. They couldn't speak. And he began to cry. All those years that he had spent, imagine how many times he must have cried himself to sleep when there was nobody to comfort him, nobody to give him a kind word, nobody, nowhere. How many times had Joseph wondered, would I ever see home again? Would I ever see my father again? Will I ever see my brother again? Will I ever see any of my family? Is this how my life ends, like this? He didn't know. But now he is beginning to see God's plan, his grand plan. He said, I'm Joseph. And they were shocked. And they began, he said, I know that you sold me into slavery. You meant it for evil, but the Lord meant it for good. And that's true. The Lord had a grand plan, and this was a method of getting all of the children of Israel, all of Jacob's children, into the land of Egypt. Egypt would be like an incubator for the nation of Israel. The Egyptians didn't like them because they were shepherds. They would not mix with them. They would not intermarry with them. That's good, because the Israelites did not want to intermix. They would be left alone. And they gave to this, actually, if you ever look at a map of Egypt, you see where the Nile River goes into a bunch of fingers out into the Mediterranean Sea. This is the land of Goshen. Plenty of water, plenty of fresh water, plenty of grass. That's where they could graze their animals, and they're left alone. Nobody bothers them. They were able to grow into a nation of about 2.5 million people in this land without being bothered, and that's what the Lord had in mind all along. And Joseph was an instrument to get them there. He had served a purpose, but he didn't know his purpose until it was done. He couldn't see what was going to happen. Joseph was a type of Christ, if you'll think about it. We see a lot of pictures of Christ in the Bible. He was sold. He was betrayed by his brothers. Jesus was betrayed by one of his disciples. He was sold for so many pieces of silver. So was Jesus. Joseph suffered for his family to save them. Jesus suffered to save us. And so you see he was a type of Jesus. And he serves as a good reminder. Sometimes we go through things and we don't know why. You can imagine when Joseph is in prison and has been there 9 years, he's thinking, is this how I die? Is this where I wind up? Nobody ever knows what happened to me until I'm just an old man and die of old age here in this prison. He had no way of knowing that the Lord would restore him. He said, go tell my father that I'm alive. And I'm going to send some chariots, not chariots, but wagons. He said, don't worry about your possessions. You'll have plenty here. You come here, I'll take care of you. And so they went back and they told Jacob. And at first he didn't believe them. He just didn't believe that Joseph could possibly be alive. And then he saw the chariots come from Egypt. Not the chariots, but the wagons. When he saw the wagons come to load the family up, then he believed. And that's all I got.